Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Legacy and Love. I am your host, Alfred Mark, and it's an honor to share this journey with you. Before we begin, let's take a moment. May your hearts be filled with love, your minds with wisdom, and your lives with endless possibilities. Now, I have one question. Are you ready? Are you ready for a story of power, ambition, and the choices that define us? Then let's begin. This is the story about legacy, about love, about the fine line between control and freedom. Welcome to Legacy and Love. Let the story unfold. The autumn wind carried a crisp chill as Eleanor Kensington stepped off the train at Grand Central Station. She inhaled deeply, the scent of roasted nuts from a nearby vendor mixing with the unmistakable aroma of Manhattan's concrete jungle. The towering skyline was a far cry from the sprawling vineyard estate she had left behind, and yet, standing in the middle of the city's ceaseless motion, she felt more alive than she had in years. Adjusting the strap of her well-worn leather satchel, she pulled her coat tighter around her frame and set off toward the university. She had chosen to travel alone, leaving behind the opulence of private jets and chauffeured limousines, much to her father's dismay. Henry Kensington, a man whose empire had turned old family wealth into a financial dynasty, had reluctantly agreed to her conditions. No Kensington bodyguards, no trust fund access, no special treatment. At least that was the plan. As she stepped into the bustling quad of Crestwood University, she felt a strange sense of anonymity. Here, among thousands of students from every background imaginable, she wasn't an heiress, she was simply Eleanor. She had barely taken 2 steps toward the dormitory when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, are you lost?" She turned to find a young man watching her with mild curiosity. His features were striking, dark brown eyes, neatly styled black hair, and an expression that suggested equal parts amusement and skepticism. He was dressed in a well-tailored jacket, expensive but not flashy, and his confidence suggested he was well aware of the impression he left on people. "No, I know exactly where I'm going," Eleanor replied smoothly. "Do you?" He tilted his head, studying her as if trying to place her. "You don't look like a freshman." "Maybe I just have an old soul," he smirked. "Or maybe you're another legacy student trying to play at being normal." Her stomach clenched slightly, but she kept her expression unreadable. "What makes you say that?" He nodded toward her luggage. "That satchel? That's an authentic vintage piece, not a cheap thrift store find. And those boots? Italian leather, handcrafted, not off the rack." His gaze met hers again. "So, either you have excellent taste, or you come from money and don't want anyone to know." Eleanor let out a small laugh. "And what about you? You don't exactly blend into the crowd." "True," he grinned, "but I don't pretend to be something I'm not." Before she could respond, he extended his hand. "Alexander Mercer, business and finance major, and you are—" She hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Eleanor." "Just Eleanor? Just Eleanor?" Alexander studied her for a beat before nodding. "All right, just Eleanor. Welcome to Crestwood. Hope you enjoy your experiment in being ordinary." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing in the middle of the bustling campus, her heart beating just a little too fast. She had come here to escape her name, to live on her own terms. And yet she had a sinking feeling that Alexander Mercer saw right through her. Eleanor had barely settled into her new dorm before realizing just how different her life at Crestwood University would be. Her roommate, a bubbly arts major named Lila Monroe, had welcomed her with open arms, immediately launching into a monologue about the best coffee spots on campus, the professors to avoid, and most importantly, the social hierarchy of Crestwood. "And at the very top of that hierarchy," Layla said dramatically, lying across her bed, "is Alexander Mercer." Eleanor, seated at her desk, froze for just a second before responding. "Alexander Mercer?" "Yeah, he's the closest thing this university has to royalty," Lili continued, unaware of Eleanor's sudden interest. "His family practically built half the business school, and he's got this whole untouchable elite vibe. Super rich, super powerful, and of course ridiculously good-looking." Eleanor fought back a smirk. "Sounds exhausting." Lila laughed. "Tell me about it. Every girl on campus either wants him or wants to be seen with him, and every guy either wants to be him or hates his guts." Eleanor thought back to their brief conversation earlier that day. He had certainly carried himself with an effortless confidence, but she had seen something else beneath the charm, curiosity, as if he was playing a game, testing her reactions. "So what's his deal?" she asked, casually. Leela shrugged. Genius-level businessman, runs his own investment firm while still in school, has some ridiculous car collection, dates models, but never for long, and, oh, is a rumor that his father is grooming him to take over Mercer Industries, which is like a multi-billion-dollar empire or something. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, her mind turning over this new information. Wait, why are you so interested? Lila sat up suddenly, narrowing her eyes. Don't tell me you've already met him. Eleanor hesitated. We crossed paths earlier. Lila gasps. And you're still alive? What did he say? Eleanor smirked. He accused me of being a legacy student trying to be normal. Lila burst out laughing. That sounds exactly like him. I swear that man can smell old money from a mile away. Eleanor only hummed in response. If Alexander Mercer was as perceptive as Lila claimed, then she would have to be extra careful around him. She had come here to escape the weight of her family name, to live outside the expectations of being a Kensington. The last thing she needed was someone like Alexander Mercer figuring out her secret. The next morning, Eleanor walked into her first business lecture and nearly turned around when she spotted Alexander sitting near the front. Of course, he would be in the same class. She took a deep breath, schooling her expression into one of complete disinterest, and found a seat near the middle of the lecture hall. It didn't take long for him to notice her. A slow smirk curved across his lips as he leaned back in his chair, watching her with open amusement. Eleanor ignored him. When class began, Professor Whitmore introduced himself and immediately launched into a discussion about economic power structures and how wealth is built and maintained over generations. It was a subject Eleanor was painfully familiar with. Now, Professor Whitmore continued, can anyone tell me the most important factor in sustaining long-term economic dominance? A few students raised their hands, giving answers about innovation, diversification, and smart investments. Alexander, however, simply leaned forward and said, control. The professor nodded approvingly. Elaborate, Mr. Mercer. Alexander's gaze flickered briefly to Eleanor before he answered. True wealth isn't about money. It's about control. Controlling markets, controlling assets, controlling influence. The families that stay on top are the ones that understand this fundamental truth. A few students muttered in agreement. Eleanor clenched her jaw. She had heard nearly the same words from her father countless times. So, would you say inherited wealth is more valuable than self-made wealth? The professor asked. Alexander tilted his head. Not necessarily, but the ones who inherit wealth and understand how to wield it are the ones who never fall. Eleanor felt his words hit deeper than they should have. She had spent her whole life preparing to inherit an empire she didn't want. Did that make her weak? She forced herself to raise her hand. But isn't there also an argument that wealth should be earned, not simply handed down? Alexander turned fully to face her, clearly intrigued. And how do you define earned? Someone born into power might spend their life ensuring that empire doesn't collapse. Doesn't that take skill? Eleanor met his gaze evenly. Perhaps, but if you never had to struggle for it, how can you claim it as your own? A few students murmured at her boldness. For a moment, Alexander simply studied her. Then he grinned. Interesting perspective. Professor Whitmore looked between them, clearly pleased. Excellent debate. I look forward to more discussions like this in the future. The lecture continued, but Eleanor barely heard the rest of it. When class ended, Alexander caught up with her just as she was gathering her things. You not what I expected, just Eleanor. She slung her bag over her shoulder. And you are exactly what I expected, Alexander Mercer. He chuckled. And what did you expect? Someone who enjoys being the smartest person in the room. He smirked. I do, but I enjoy it even more when someone challenges me. Eleanor arched a brow. So, I'm a challenge now? He stepped closer, his presence almost overpowering. You were the second you walked onto this campus, pretending to be something you're not. Her breath caught, but she kept her voice steady. And what do you think I'm pretending to be? His gaze dropped briefly to the handmade bracelet on her wrist, a stark contrast to the rest of her carefully simple attire. Normal, he murmured. The single word sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, he stepped back and flashed her an infuriatingly confident grin. See you around, just Eleanor. And then he was gone, leaving her standing in the empty lecture hall, her heart pounding against her ribs. For the first time since arriving at Crestwood, she felt truly exposed. Alexander Mercer was dangerous, not in the obvious sense, but because he saw things other people didn't, and she had a feeling he wouldn't stop until he uncovered every secret she was trying so hard to keep. Eleanor had spent her entire life navigating people like Alexander Mercer, men who wielded power like a weapon, who saw the world as a chessboard and everyone around them as pieces to be moved. She had learned from the best. Her father, Henry Kensington, had built an empire through calculated decisions, strategic partnerships, and an unshakable belief that control was the ultimate currency. She had spent years studying under him, watching as he sealed multi-million-dollar deals with nothing more than a handshake and an unspoken promise of consequences if his terms weren't met. And yet, despite all her training, she felt the beginnings of a miscalculation with Alexander Mercer. Because unlike the business titan she had known, Alexander wasn't simply playing for power, he was playing for amusement. And that made him unpredictable. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in the campus coffee shop, attempting to focus on her economics reading. She had been in Crestwood for less than 48 hours, and already she was attracting more attention than she had planned. It wasn't just Alexander. It was the way people had started noticing her after that classroom debate, the way whispers followed her as she passed by. She needed to control the narrative before it spiraled out of her hands. Mind if I join you? She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Alexander slid into the chair across from her, placing his coffee on the table as if he belonged there. Eleanor exhaled sharply, closing her book. Do I have a choice? He smirked. There's always a choice, but I have a feeling you're just as curious about me as I am about you. She tilted her head, studying him. What exactly do you think I'm curious about? He leaned back in his chair, draping one arm over the backrest in a way that was both casual and deliberate. You're trying to figure out whether I see you as a threat or an amusement. Her lips twitched. Do I get to pick? Alexander chuckled. I haven't decided yet. She sipped her coffee, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Good, because I haven't decided what you are to me either. There it was again, that flicker of interest in his dark eyes. A challenge? An invitation? Something neither of them had expected when they first met. Tell me, just Eleanor, Alexander mused, tapping his fingers against the table. What's your game here? She arched a brow. Game? You're not like the other students here, he said. You're careful, too careful. You want to blend in, but not too much. You don't want people asking questions, but at the same time, you're not afraid to challenge me in a room full of people who would never dare. Eleanor shrugged. Maybe I just enjoy a good debate. Maybe, he said, watching her closely. Or maybe you're trying very hard to keep people from looking too closely at who you really are. Her heart stuttered for the briefest second before she forced herself to remain still. She had known from the moment he first spoke to her that Alexander Mercer was perceptive, but she hadn't realized just how much. That's an interesting theory, she said smoothly, placing her cup down. But you know what I think? Alexander smirked. Enlighten me. I think you're not used to people telling you no, she said, tilting her head. I think you expect people to either worship you or fear you, and when someone does neither, you don't know what to do with them. His smile didn't fade, but there was something sharper behind it now. And which one are you? Neither, she said, standing up. Alexander watched her with amusement as she slung her bag over her shoulder. Walking away already? He asked. She smirked. Not walking away, just letting you wonder. He chuckled, shaking his head as she turned and made her way toward the door. But just as she reached it, he called out, For the record, just Eleanor. She paused, glancing back. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice low but confident. You intrigue me. Eleanor's stomach flipped, but she refused to show it. Instead, she simply smiled. Good. Let's see how long that lasts. And then she was gone. But as she stepped onto the busy sidewalk, the cool autumn air rushing against her skin, she knew one thing for certain. She had just made her first move. And if Alexander Mercer wanted to play, she wasn't about to lose. That night, Eleanor found herself sitting on her bed, staring at her phone. There was one unread message. Father, call me. She hesitated. Her father hadn't contacted her since she left for Crestwood. She'd expected him to let her be for a while, to let her prove that she could do this on her own. But if he was reaching out now, it meant he had heard something. And Henry Kensington never liked being caught off guard. Taking a steady breath, she dialed his number. He answered on the first ring. Eleanor, he said, his voice calm but firm. I hear you've made an impression already. She clenched her jaw. I didn't realize my college life was being reported back to you so quickly. Everything is reported back to me, he said smoothly. You should know that by now. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. What do you want, Father? A pause. Then, stay away from Alexander Mercer. Her breath caught. She had expected him to ask about her studies, to remind her of the responsibility she carried, but this was unexpected. Why? She asked carefully. Because the Mercer family is not one we involve ourselves with, he said, his voice laced with something she rarely heard from him. A warning. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had spent her entire life following her father's rules, obeying his warnings without question, but for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted to. Because if Alexander Mercer was someone her father didn't want her near, then maybe he was exactly the kind of person she needed to know. Eleanor stared at her phone long after the call ended, her father's words echoing in her mind. Stay away from Alexander Mercer? She had spent her whole life following Henry Kensington's rules, learning from his calculated strategies, watching as he turned business rivals into allies or crushed them completely. He rarely gave direct warnings, which meant Alexander Mercer wasn't just some wealthy playboy at Crestwood. He was a problem. And Eleanor had never been the kind of person to walk away from a problem. The next morning, Eleanor was halfway through reviewing case studies in the library when Leela dropped into the seat across from her, breathless with excitement. You, Leela said dramatically, pointing a finger at Eleanor, are officially the most talked about girl on campus. Eleanor raised a brow. That's unfortunate. Lila grinned. Oh, don't play innocent. You got into a public debate with Alexander Mercer in class, then had coffee with him, and now what? Eleanor asked, already dreading the answer. Lila smirked. You've been invited to the Midnight Club. Eleanor blinked. The what? Lila gasped. You don't know about the Midnight Club? Okay, this is actually perfect, because if you did, that would mean you were secretly one of Crestwood's elite, and I'm still pretending you're just a normal, super interesting person and not secretly an heiress or something? Eleanor swallowed her amusement. And what exactly is the Midnight Club? Lila leaned in conspiratorially. It's an exclusive, invite-only gathering for Crestwood's most powerful students. Legacy kids, finance prodigies, future CEOs. They meet at some ridiculous penthouse once a month to discuss business, drink $1,000 champagne, and let me guess, Eleanor interrupted, Alexander Mercer is the one who decides who gets invited? Lila grinned. Ding, 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 and guess whose name is on the list for this Saturday? Eleanor didn't answer right away. Alexander was testing her. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a challenge, a warning from her father, an invitation from Alexander, 2 doors leading in opposite directions. And yet, Eleanor had never been one to back away from the unknown. The Mercer penthouse was exactly what Eleanor expected, sleek, modern, and absurdly luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city skyline, and a curated crowd of Crestwood's elite moved through the space, glasses of aged whiskey and vintage wine in hand. Lila had been right. This wasn't just a party, it was a gathering of the future power players of the world, and Alexander Mercer was at its center. He stood near the bar, engaged in effortless conversation with 2 older men who clearly weren't students. Investors, maybe, business partners. Eleanor didn't need to hear their conversation to know that Alexander was entirely in control. She had seen her father command a room in the same way, and just as she decided she would rather observe than participate, Alexander's gaze landed on her. He excused himself from the conversation and crossed the room, his expression unreadable. You came, he said, voice low but certain. Eleanor tilted her head. Would you have preferred I didn't? He smirked. No. I would have been disappointed if you let my invitation scare you away. She took a sip of champagne, meeting his gaze without hesitation. You don't strike me as someone who gets disappointed often. You'd be surprised, he murmured. There was something dangerous in the way he was looking at her. Something that made her feel as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an unknown depth. You don't belong in this world, Alexander said suddenly. Eleanor raised a brow. And what world do I belong in? He leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to send a chill down her spine. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Her pulse quickened. Because the truth was, so was she. The next morning, Eleanor found another message from her father. Father, I know you went to the Mercer event. We need to talk. Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. This time, she didn't hesitate. She dialed the number her father picked up immediately. "You're playing a dangerous game." Eleanor gripped the edge of her desk. "I'm just attending social events." "You're engaging with a family we do not associate with," he corrected. She frowned. "Why do you hate the Mercers so much?" A beat of silence. "Then the Kensingtons and the Mercers have never been allies," he said, "and I don't intend for that to change." "That's not an answer," Eleanor said, her voice even. Her father exhaled sharply. "You need to understand something, Eleanor. The Mercer family plays by their own rules. They build empires and burn bridges without hesitation. They will use whoever they need to get ahead. If you think Alexander Mercer is harmless, you're already underestimating him." Eleanor's grip tightened. She wasn't naive. She knew Alexander was dangerous, but what her father failed to realize was, so was she. "Stay away from him," her father warned one last time, and this time, Eleanor didn't answer, because she knew she wasn't going to. Eleanor had spent years mastering the art of control, of keeping her emotions guarded, her actions deliberate, her presence undetected when necessary. But Alexander Mercer was different. He was pushing her in ways she hadn't expected, and worse, she was letting him. Her father's warning still echoed in her mind. The Mercer family plays by their own rules. If you think Alexander Mercer is harmless, you're already underestimating him. But what her father didn't understand was that Eleanor had never been one to shy away from danger. She had spent her entire life being told who to associate with, who to trust, who to avoid, and for the first time, she wanted to make that decision for herself, even if it meant walking straight into the fire. The crisp autumn air was sharp against Eleanor's skin as she made her way across campus. She had barely stepped into the business school lobby when she saw him. Alexander was leaning against one of the marble pillars, dressed in a tailored black coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, waiting for her. Eleanor slowed her pace, schooling her features into something unreadable. He watched her approach with an expression that was almost amused, as if he had expected her hesitation. "Skipping class today?" she asked dryly. Alexander smirked. "I could ask you the same thing." She stopped in front of him, tilting her head. "Something tells me you're not here for the lecture." "You're right," he said smoothly. "I have a business proposition for you." Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me?" Alexander pushed off the pillar, stepping closer. "I want you to work with me." She narrowed her eyes. "Work with you?" He nodded. "I'm expanding my portfolio, looking into strategic investments beyond what my father already controls. And I need someone who understands both sides of the game, someone who knows how to play the long-term strategy, not just chase short-term wins." Eleanor studied him carefully. "And you think that person is me?" "I know it is." His confidence was infuriating. And yet, a part of her was intrigued. She had been raised to run an empire, to make decisions that impacted entire industries. But she had never been given the chance to do it on her own. Her father still controlled every move she made. This was different. This was an opportunity. And Alexander knew exactly what he was offering. Still, she wasn't about to make it easy for him. "Why me?" she asked, crossing her arms. Alexander's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Because you're the only person at this school who isn't afraid of me," he said simply. Eleanor's breath caught, because it wasn't a compliment, it was a fact. And maybe that was why she hadn't walked away yet. That evening, Eleanor found herself seated in a sleek, glass-walled office on the top floor of Mercer Tower, Alexander's personal headquarters in the city. The building was modern and minimalistic, a reflection of its owner. And yet, there was an undeniable weight to it, a presence that reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. Alexander leaned back in his chair across from her, his gaze assessing. "This isn't an internship," he said. "I don't need someone fetching coffee or sitting in meetings to take notes. I need someone who can anticipate moves before they happen. Someone who can think like I do." Eleanor arched a brow. "And you think I can do that?" Alexander's smirk deepened. "That's what we're about to find out." He pushed a file across the table. Eleanor glanced at it before meeting his gaze. "What's this?" "A company I'm considering investing in. I want your take on it." She opened the file, scanning the pages. "A mid-sized tech firm specializing in artificial intelligence, promising innovation, moderate market penetration." Steady growth. But something was off. Eleanor frowned. She flipped through the financials, her mind working through the numbers, and then she saw it. A pattern in the expenditures, a quiet but consistent shift in asset allocation. They were preparing for a buyout, not a merger, not an expansion, a liquidation. Eleanor closed the file and set it down. "Walk away," she said. Alexander's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of something behind his eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Because in 6 months, this company will be worth half of what it is now," she said evenly. "They're positioning themselves for an exit, not growth. If you buy in now, you'll be left holding the pieces when they sell off their assets." Silence. Then, a slow, satisfied smile. "Interesting," Alexander murmured. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You already knew, didn't you?" His smile widened. "Of course I did." Annoyance flared in her chest. "Then why ask me?" "Because I needed to see if you would figure it out." Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "You were testing me." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was," he admitted, "and you passed." The room felt smaller suddenly, or maybe it was just the way he was looking at her, like she was no longer just an opponent but something else entirely, something worth watching, something worth keeping. Eleanor exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. "Is this how you do business?" she asked. "Lure people in with half-truths just to see if they can keep up?" Alexander chuckled. "Only when I'm interested in them." Her stomach flipped, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing it. Instead, she stood, smoothing down her blazer. "If you want my help, you'll need to do better than that," she said. Alexander watched her for a beat, then stood as well. "I'll keep that in mind." Eleanor turned toward the door, but before she could leave, his voice stopped her. "Eleanor?" She hesitated, glancing back. His expression was unreadable. "Are you sure you're ready to play this game?" She held his gaze, unflinching. "I was raised for this game, Alexander," she said. "The question is, are you?" And then she walked out, leaving him standing in the glass-walled office, watching her go with an expression that was anything but indifferent. Because for the first time in a long time, Alexander Mercer had met his match. Eleanor had never been one to let emotions cloud her judgment. That was one of the first lessons her father had drilled into her. Business is about strategy, not feelings. The moment you let personal emotions interfere, you lose. And yet, walking out of Mercer Tower that night, she couldn't shake the sensation that she had just stepped into something far more complicated than a business deal. Alexander Mercer wasn't just testing her. He was studying her, and that made him dangerous, not just to her carefully constructed plans, but to the version of herself she had fought so hard to protect. The next morning, Eleanor found herself back at Crestwood, seated at a corner table in the campus cafe, staring at her laptop screen. She had meant to review investment reports, but her mind kept drifting to Alexander, to the way he had looked at her after she passed his test, to the unspoken challenge in his words. "Are you sure you're ready to play this game?" Damn him. She didn't have time for distractions. And yet, as if the universe was conspiring against her, losing focus, just Eleanor? Her jaw clenched at the familiar voice. She glanced up to see Alexander sliding into the seat across from her, the usual smirk playing on his lips. "You have an annoying habit of showing up uninvited," she said, shutting her laptop. "And yet, you never seem to leave when I do," he countered. She exhaled sharply. "Did you need something, or are you just here to be insufferable?" He chuckled. "Actually, I do need something." Eleanor arched a brow. "Should I be concerned?" "That depends," Alexander said, leaning back. "Are you free Friday night?" Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" "A dinner, important people, high-stakes conversations. And I need a +1 who won't embarrass me." She studied him, searching for the hidden motive. "You do have friends, don't you?" she asked dryly. Alexander smirked. "I have associates, but none of them would be as interesting." Eleanor hated that his words sent a flicker of satisfaction through her. This was a power play, an invitation to something bigger, and she wasn't about to back down. "Fine," she said, tilting her chin, "but I expect dinner to be actually worth my time." His gaze flickered with amusement. "I don't disappoint, Eleanor." She rolled her eyes. "We'll see about that." Friday night arrived faster than expected. Eleanor had been to enough high society events to know how these things worked, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just a show of wealth, it was a show of power. The dinner was held in a private lounge atop one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Soft jazz played in the background, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Every guest was someone important: CEOs, investors, politicians, and Alexander moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never known a world where doors weren't open for him. Eleanor stayed close but observant, taking in the dynamics, the silent negotiations happening between clinks of glasses and carefully worded pleasantries. "Impressed?" Alexander murmured beside her. She sipped her wine. "I've seen better," he chuckled. "Of course you have." A tall man in his 50s approached, exuding authority. His sharp eyes scanned Eleanor before turning to Alexander. "This must be your new business partner," the man said smoothly. Eleanor recognized him immediately: Daniel Lockwood, a name that carried weight in the world of finance. "A pleasure," Eleanor said, extending her hand. Lockwood's grip was firm, testing. "I hear you have quite the eye for investments." Eleanor glanced at Alexander, who said nothing, leaving the moment entirely to her. So she smiled. "And I hear you have quite the reputation for betting on the wrong ones?" A beat of silence. Then Lockwood threw his head back and laughed. "Mercer, I like this one." Eleanor caught the flicker of approval in Alexander's eyes. The game had just begun. Hours later, as the dinner wound down, Alexander led Eleanor to a quieter corner of the lounge. "You handled Lockwood well," he said. Eleanor crossed her arms. "Was that another test?" "Everything is a test," he admitted. She studied him, searching for cracks in his armor. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alexander," she said. His smirk faded slightly. "So are you." For the first time that night, there was no teasing in his voice, no amusement, just something unreadable, something that felt too much like a warning. She should have walked away. She should have listened to her father's advice. But instead, she held his gaze and said, "Then I guess we'll see who wins." And the way Alexander looked at her in that moment, like she was both a challenge and a temptation, made Eleanor realize one thing: this wasn't just about business anymore, and that terrified her more than anything. Eleanor had spent her entire life drawing invisible lines between herself and the people around her, lines that protected her, lines that kept her from getting too close, because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness. But Alexander Mercer had a habit of stepping over lines like they didn't exist, and that was dangerous. Because Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to stop him. The black town car cut through the city streets, gliding past illuminated skyscrapers and crowded late-night cafes. Eleanor sat beside Alexander in the back seat, the tension from the dinner still hanging between them. "You played your part well tonight," Alexander said, breaking the silence. Eleanor smirked, turning to face him. "Was that all I was? A part to be played?" His dark eyes flickered with amusement. "Would it bother you if you were?" "No," she lied. Alexander chuckled, his gaze dropping to her lips for the briefest second before returning to her eyes. "You're different from what I expected, Eleanor." "And what exactly did you expect?" she asked. He exhaled, watching her carefully. Someone who wanted power, but didn't understand how to wield it. Someone born into privilege, but afraid to take risks. Eleanor tilted her head. "And now?" "Now," he murmured, "I think you might be more dangerous than I am." A challenge, a warning, a truth neither of them was ready to say out loud. The car slowed to a stop outside her dorm. Eleanor hesitated. There was a moment, one neither of them acknowledged, where the air between them felt thick, like something was about to break. But Eleanor wasn't ready to let. So instead, she opened the door and stepped out. She turned back, meeting Alexander's gaze one last time. "Good night, Mercer." His smirk was slow, calculated. "Good night, just Eleanor." And then she walked away. But the heat of his stare followed her long after she disappeared inside. Eleanor barely had time to process the night before. Her phone buzzed the next morning. "Father, we need to talk. Now." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a request, it was a demand. A few minutes later, she sat in her dorm, her laptop open for a video call. Her father's face appeared on the screen, his expression unreadable. "I warned you, Eleanor." She folded her arms. "Good morning to you too, Father." His jaw tightened. Don't play games with me. I know about last night. Eleanor exhaled. It was a business dinner. It was an invitation, he corrected, and you accepted it, she frowned. Why does it matter so much to you? Her father leaned forward. Because the Mercers are not to be trusted. Why? He hesitated. And for the first time, Eleanor saw something unusual in his expression. Not just anger, not just control, but something else. Something close to fear. This isn't just business, Eleanor, he said finally. The Mercer family has built their empire by making enemies disappear, by doing whatever it takes to win. And if you think Alexander is any different, then you're not as smart as I thought you were. Her chest tightened because deep down a part of her had already considered the possibility. But hearing her father confirm it, that was something else entirely. This is my life, she said carefully, and my decision. Her father's expression darkened. Not if you want to remain at Kensington. A threat, one she hadn't expected. You wouldn't do that, she said, her voice quieter now. Try me. Eleanor swallowed hard, and for the first time, she wondered, had she just made a mistake she couldn't undo? The following week, Eleanor tried to put distance between herself and Alexander. She avoided the cafe where they usually ran into each other. She sat on the opposite side of the lecture hall. She buried herself in schoolwork. And it worked. For exactly 2 days. Then, after class on Wednesday, she walked out of the business school to find Alexander waiting for her. She froze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. You've been avoiding me, he said. She forced a neutral expression. I've been busy. His smirk didn't reach his eyes. Try again. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temple. I don't owe you an explanation, Mercer. No, he agreed, but that's not going to stop me from getting one. She exhaled sharply. This, whatever this is, needs to stop. For the first time since she met him, Alexander looked genuinely caught off guard. Why? She clenched her jaw. 'Cause I don't trust you. Silence. Then, you shouldn't trust me, he said quietly. But that's never stopped you before. Her pulse raced. She needed to leave. She needed to end this before it became something neither of them could walk away from. But then, he stepped closer, so close she could smell his cologne, feel the warmth of his body in the cold autumn air. And for the first time, she let herself wonder, what would happen if she didn't walk away? What if, for once, she stopped playing by the rules? What if... Eleanor! Her head snapped up at the sound of a familiar voice. She turned, and her heart stopped, because standing a few feet away, watching the entire exchange with an expression of barely concealed fury, was her father. Eleanor felt the world slow. The sound of students laughing in the distance faded. The only thing that existed in that moment was the storm brewing in her father's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but he was already striding toward her. Alexander tensed beside her. Get in the car, Eleanor, her father said. She swallowed. Father, Now, a command, a demand, an ultimatum. She hesitated, and that was all the confirmation her father needed. You've made a mistake, Eleanor, he said coldly, and you're about to learn what happens when you cross the wrong people. Her blood ran cold, but before she could respond, he turned to Alexander and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. You must be Alexander Mercer, he said. Alexander's expression didn't change. And you must be Henry Kensington. The two men stared at each other, assessing, calculating. Two kings in a game Eleanor hadn't even realized she was a pawn in. And then, her father extended a hand. Let's have a chat, shall we? Eleanor's breath caught, because suddenly she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a war. And she wasn't sure who was going to win. Eleanor had been in high-stakes negotiations before. She had watched her father close billion-dollar deals with nothing more than a sharp gaze and a carefully worded promise, but she had never seen him like this. Not with her, not with Alexander Mercer. Her father's outstretched hand lingered in the air between them, a silent challenge. For the first time, Eleanor saw the resemblance between Henry Kensington and Alexander Mercer, two men who had built their empires on power, control, and the ability to read people like a carefully written contract. Alexander's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smirk. He took her father's hand, shaking it once. By all means, he said smoothly. Let's talk. The drive was silent. Eleanor sat stiffly between her father and Alexander in the back seat of a sleek black car. the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate her. Her father had insisted they leave campus immediately. Alexander, to her utter surprise, had agreed without hesitation, and now they were on their way to a private club Eleanor knew all too well, one of the many Kensington-owned establishments that catered to Manhattan's elite, the kind of place where deals were made over a glass of expensive scotch. Her father had chosen the battlefield. The question was, what game was he about to play? The moment they stepped inside the private lounge, her father dismissed the staff, ensuring no one else would overhear the conversation. Alexander, of course, didn't look remotely fazed. If anything, he looked amused. Eleanor wasn't sure if that made her want to strangle him or warn him. Her father poured himself a drink before finally turning to them. "I'm going to be direct," he said, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "You are a problem, Alexander." Alexander smirked. "I've been called worse." Her father ignored the remark. "Whatever game you're playing with my daughter, it ends now." Eleanor's breath caught, but Alexander remained relaxed. His voice was calm when he spoke. "And if I say no?" Her father smiled, didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll ensure the Mercer name means nothing in this city by the end of the year." Silence. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She had expected a confrontation, but she hadn't expected this. Alexander studied her father for a long moment before speaking. "Let me make something clear, Mr. Kensington," he said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "I don't respond to threats." Her father's jaw tightened. "You think you're untouchable?" "No," Alexander mused. "I just think you're used to people backing down, and I don't do that." Eleanor exhaled slowly. This was a war, and neither man was willing to lose. Eleanor had spent the last few weeks trying to figure out what Alexander Mercer was to her. A distraction, a challenge, a mistake waiting to happen. But now she was standing between two titans ready to destroy each other, and she wasn't sure who she wanted to stop more. "Father," she said carefully, "you're overreacting." Her father turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Am I?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Alexander and I are business partners." Alexander didn't correct her. Neither did her father. Instead, he set his drink down, tilting his head. "Tell me, Eleanor," he said, "do you trust him?" She hesitated. That was all the answer he needed. Her father exhaled, looking back at Alexander. "You're playing a dangerous game," Alexander smirked. "So I've been told." Her father's eyes darkened. "I suggest you find someone else to play with." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Eleanor standing there, trapped between the past she had always known and the future she wasn't sure she wanted. The drive back to campus was silent. Alexander didn't ask if she was okay. Eleanor didn't ask if he was angry. They both already knew the answers. When they finally pulled up to Crestwood, Eleanor turned to him. "This is getting out of control." Alexander chuckled. "You are aware I didn't start this, right?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "That doesn't matter. My father doesn't make empty threats." "Neither do I," Alexander murmured. Eleanor hesitated. "So what happens now?" Alexander studied her for a long moment before answering. "Now," he said, his voice softer. "Now you decide." "Decide what?" "Whose side you're really on." And just like that, she realized this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about everything. Her father, her future, the life she had been raised to inherit versus the life she wanted to build. She had spent her whole life making choices that weren't really choices at all. But this one was hers, and she had no idea what she was going to do. Eleanor had always believed in control, in choosing her battles, in keeping her emotions buried beneath logic and strategy. But standing between Alexander Mercer and her father, she realized there was no right choice this time, because no matter what she did, someone was going to lose. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she cared. 2 days passed before Eleanor heard from her father again. She had expected another warning, a final threat, but instead he sent a car, a silent demand to meet him. When she arrived at his private office, he was already seated at his desk, fingers steepled together. "Sit," he said. She did. Her father didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "I was hard on you the other night." Eleanor's brow furrowed. Her father never apologized. "That's an understatement," she muttered. He ignored her. "You're angry. I understand, but you need to listen to me now." She crossed her arms. "I'm listening," her father exhaled, leaning forward. "I'm giving you a choice, Eleanor." Her stomach tightened. "What kind of choice?" His expression was unreadable. Come work for me. She blinked. What? Full time. No more school. No more distractions. I'll give you a position within Kensington Enterprises, one where you can actually use your intelligence, your skills. No more pretending to be normal. No more wasting your time. Eleanor's chest tightened. This was what she had wanted her whole life. A real seat at the table. But there was a catch. There's a condition, isn't there? She asked quietly. Her father's gaze was sharp. Stay away from Alexander Mercer. Eleanor's throat went dry. Of course. This wasn't just about her. It was about eliminating a threat. It was about control. Her father was giving her exactly what she wanted as long as she walked away from Alexander, and for the first time, Eleanor realized she wasn't sure if she could. She didn't go back to campus right away. Instead, she found herself at the only place that made sense, Mercer Tower. Alexander's private office was dimly lit when she arrived, the city skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was seated at his desk, going over documents, but the moment he saw her, he frowned. Bad day? He asked. Eleanor exhaled. Something like that. She hesitated before stepping forward. I need to ask you something, she said. Alexander set his pen down. I'm listening, she swallowed. My father told me to stay away from you. His smirk was slow, knowing. That's not surprising. He also offered me a position in the company. That wiped the amusement from his face. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. If I take it, I have to walk away from you, from this. Alexander didn't look away. And what do you want? He asked. That was the real question, wasn't it? What did she want? She had spent her whole life chasing a future her father had mapped out for her, but then Alexander had come into her life, and suddenly she wasn't so sure anymore. I don't know, she admitted. Alexander stood, walking toward her. Do you trust me? He asked. Her breath hitched. Did she? Did it even matter? Because no matter what happened next, one thing was clear. She had already fallen too far to turn back now. Eleanor had always believed that choices defined a person, not wealth, not legacy, not family names carved into glass towers and steel skyscrapers, but the choices people made when no one was watching. And right now, she was standing at a crossroads. One path led to safety, certainty. The future she had always been told was hers. Straight into the unknown, straight into Alexander Mercer, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to play it safe anymore. Alexander watched her carefully. Wait. Eleanor exhaled, steadying herself. You asked me if I trust you, she said. He nodded, silent. And the truth is, she swallowed, I don't know. His lips twitched. Honest, I respect that. But I do know this, she continued, stepping closer. Every time I walk away from you, I end up right back here. Alexander's smirk faded, his expression unreadable. This is dangerous, Eleanor, he murmured. She met his gaze. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then, come with me, her stomach flipped. Where? Somewhere we can talk, Alexander said. Without our fathers, without the rest of the world watching. It was reckless. It was impulsive. It was insane. But Eleanor heard herself say, okay. And just like that, she had made her choice. They drove without speaking for nearly an hour, out of the city, past the glittering skyline, away from the power plays and unspoken wars, until they reached a secluded estate nestled along the cliffs. Eleanor stepped out of the car, glancing around. Where are we? Alexander shoved his hands into his pockets. My family's private retreat. No one knows we're here. She hesitated. So why bring me? His dark eyes locked onto hers. Because I needed to talk to you without anyone else interfering. A shiver ran down her spine. She followed him inside. The house was sleek, modern, yet somehow warm, the kind of place built for isolation, not entertainment. Alexander poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing her one. Then, finally, he spoke. You're not the only one being given a choice, Eleanor. She frowned. What do you mean? He exhaled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. My father has his own plans for me. Ones that don't include you. Her heart pounded. Alexander's voice was steady. He told me to stay away from you, too. She sucked in a breath. And? His gaze burned into hers. And I said no. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her glass. She had expected him to be calculating, to weigh the risks. But he had already made his choice, just like she had. "A war is coming, Eleanor," he said quietly, "and if you stand with me, there's no turning back." Her pulse raced. Everything in her life had been built on rules, on alliances that had been decided long before she was born, but standing in that house, looking into Alexander's eyes, for the first time she felt like she was choosing something for herself. So she set down her glass, stepped closer and said, "Then let's win." Eleanor had spent her whole life playing by the rules, rules dictated by power, by wealth, by the invisible expectations that came with being a Kensington. But tonight, in Alexander Mercer's private retreat, she was rewriting them. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt from the ocean below the cliffs. Eleanor stood on the balcony staring out at the dark waves crashing against the rocks. Behind her, Alexander leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You're thinking," he said. She exhaled. "I always think," he smirked. "I noticed." She turned to face him. "What happens now?" He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "We make the first move before they do." Her stomach tightened. "You mean your father and mine have been running this city for years," Alexander said. "Everything we do is a risk, but if we wait for them to strike first, we lose." Eleanor clenched her jaw. He was right. They weren't just two heirs caught in the middle of a family rivalry. They were the ones who had the power to change it. But that also meant they were the ones with the most to lose. She met his gaze. "So what's the plan?" A slow, dangerous smile spread across Alexander's face. "I thought you'd never ask." The next morning, Eleanor and Alexander arrived back in the city together, and they made sure everyone saw them. If their fathers wanted to control them, wanted to pull the strings from behind the scenes, then Eleanor and Alexander would force their hands first. They walked into the Crestwood Business Hall side by side, whispers following them like shadows. By noon, their families' names were all over the news. Kensington heir and Mercer Empire's successor, a new power couple or a dangerous alliance. It was reckless, it was bold, and it was exactly what they needed. Because the moment their father saw the headlines, they would have to respond. Eleanor didn't have to wait long. That evening, she walked into her apartment to find her father waiting for her. The silence between them was thick. "Then, you're making a mistake, Eleanor," her father said. She didn't blink. "No, I'm making a choice." His jaw tightened. "You think aligning yourself with him makes you powerful?" "It makes me free," she countered. For the first time, her father looked surprised, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "You playing with fire," he warned. Eleanor exhaled. "Then let me burn." By the time she left her father's apartment, her decision was solidified. She met Alexander at Mercer Tower, stepping into his office without hesitation. "It's done," she said. Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're sure?" She nodded. "I'm all in." Something flickered in his dark eyes, something like approval. Then, without another word, he reached into his desk drawer and slid a folder toward her. She opened it, and her breath caught. It wasn't just business plans. It was leverage. Documents, secrets, proof of every strategic move they could use to take control, to become more powerful than their fathers ever expected them to be. Eleanor looked up at him. "You've been planning this?" she murmured. Alexander smirked. "I was just waiting for you to catch up." A shiver ran down her spine. Because this wasn't just business anymore. This was war, and they were about to win it. Eleanor had always known she was destined for power, but not like this. Not by standing beside Alexander Mercer, armed with secrets and strategies that could dismantle empires. Not by going against the man who had shaped her entire life, her own father. And yet, as she sat across from Alexander in the dimly lit office of Mercer Tower, staring at the final pieces of their plan, she felt something she never had before. Control. Not the kind handed down through bloodlines. The kind she had taken for herself. And she wasn't about to give it back. The plan was simple. Not destruction, not chaos. Redirection. Eleanor had spent years watching her father build an empire, manipulating people, controlling markets, making sure no one ever had the power to question him. But he had a weakness. Every empire did, and she and Alexander were about to expose it. "We leak the documents at midnight," Alexander said, tapping a folder on his desk. Eleanor nodded. "And by morning, Kensington Enterprises will be too busy covering their tracks to focus on us." Her father had spent years hiding questionable deals, shifting money, securing partnerships in the shadows. Nothing illegal, but enough to make investors nervous, enough to make them reconsider. And in business, perception was everything. If the world thought Kensington Enterprises was unstable, his allies would hesitate. His control would weaken, and Eleanor would be free. The next morning, the headlines broke. "Kensington Empire under scrutiny. Internal documents raise questions about future stability." Wall Street reacts. Could this be the beginning of a power shift? Phones rang, stocks fluctuated, meetings were called, and Henry Kensington was no longer focused on her. He was focused on survival. Eleanor had played her move, and she had won. She met her father that evening, not in his office, not in some private lounge, at their family home, his sanctuary. And when she arrived, he was waiting for her in the study, a drink in his hand. "You've been busy," he said, voice calm. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You taught me well." A beat of silence. Then, her father exhaled. "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing she would ever get. Eleanor stepped forward. "This isn't about revenge, Father. It's about freedom. My freedom." He studied her for a long moment. Then don't waste it. And just like that, the war was over. Her father didn't disown her, didn't threaten her. He simply accepted what he could not change, and that was a victory all on its own. That night, Eleanor met Alexander at the top of Mercer Tower. The city stretched out before them, 1,000 lights flickering like stars. "It's done," she said. Alexander smirked. "How does it feel?" She exhaled. "Strange, free, terrifying." He stepped closer. "You'll get used to it." Eleanor turned to him, searching his expression. "And you? What now?" Alexander studied her, his smirk fading into something softer. "Now," he said, "we build something better." Eleanor had spent her life following a path someone else had written, but now? Now she was standing at the edge of something new, something hers. And as she looked at Alexander, she realized this wasn't just power, it was partnership, it was possibility. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because this was just the beginning. And that, my beautiful family, is the end of legacy and love. We've walked through power struggles, impossible choices, and a love that defied expectations, but one thing remains true. Our choices shape our future, and sometimes the greatest risk leads to the greatest reward. Now, I have one final question. Did you enjoy the journey? If this story made you think, feel, or dream, let me know. Your support means everything. Remember, your legacy is yours to create, and love is the most powerful force of all. Until next time, stay strong, stay fearless, and never be afraid to rewrite your own story. This is Alpha Mark signing off. Much love to you all.